The book begins by establishing its goal, the study of the era of dissolution and the required behavior for a specific human type. Man inwardly belongs to the world of tradition, ruled by transcendent principles, the antithesis of the dissolving modern bourgeois world. Since constructive external action is futile, the man of tradition, who cannot isolate himself, must cut every tie with the bourgeois world and seek inner invulnerability. The crisis, viewed as a negation of the bourgeois world's negation of tradition, can potentially create a new free space or lead to chaos. This era is the Kali Yuga, dissolution, where past norms are obsolete. The strategy is riding the tiger. Avoid futile resistance. Let chaotic forces run their course while maintaining internal stability and individual value. European nihilism, symbolized by Nietzsche's God is dead, marks the collapse of all values and desacralization from tradition. Morality dissolves. From autonomous reason to utilitarian social ethics, bourgeois conformity, defining the human condition as absurd/meaningless. The first phenomenon to emerge after the death of God is autonomous morality, which is independent of theology and metaphysics and founded solely on the authority of reason. This process sees the absolute descending from the lost level of the sacred to the level of pure human morality, defining a rationalistic phase characterized by the stoicism of duty or moral fetishism, and is specifically characteristic of Protestantism. The subsequent phase is defined by utilitarian or social ethics, where the justification for moral norms is reduced to what benefits the individual's material tranquility within communal life. Nihilism is already evident in this stage because, lacking internal constraints, any act is deemed permissible if external legal social sanction can be avoided or disregarded. This orientation defines the bourgeois world, a system of social idols and conformism based on inertia, hypocrisy, cowardice, or mere convenience. The individualism of the late 19th century further accelerated the dissolution of this bourgeois phase, leading toward anarchy. This trend connects back to romantic figures who defied conventional laws. Evola identifies the culmination of this conceptual journey in Max Stirner, who saw all morality as the ultimate form of a fetishized divinity that must be destroyed. Stirner denounced the notion of an internal God dictating law as merely an insidious transposition of the external, negated theological afterlife. By exalting the lawless, unique one, who posits his cause in nothingness, Stirner marked the endpoint for the revolutionary social nihilists who, unlike him, still relied on utopian ideas like justice or liberty. Evola also references Dostoevsky's idea that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, and notes that nihilism encompasses the collapse of morality as well as the domains of truth, worldview, and purpose. The death of God is linked to the loss of any ultimate meaning or superior justification for existence. Nietzsche termed the resulting state, where the world of truth and values invented for evasion has dissolved, leaving only the reality previously denied. The tragic phase of nihilism, which is the beginning of the misery of the man without God. Existence appears devoid of meaning or purpose. Evola connects this theme to Dostoevsky's character Kirillov, who stated that man invented God only to avoid killing himself, viewing God as an alienation of the I. The contemporary existentialist position, articulated by Sartre, declares that even if God existed, nothing would change. Existence is left to itself in its bare reality, without any external reference point, to provide true meaning for man. This leads to two phases: a metaphysical or moral rebellion, followed by a stage where the motives for revolt dissipate, leaving the dominant theme of the absurdity and sheer irrationality of the human condition. Dissolution expanded from precursors, Dadaism, Surrealism, to post-World War II, burned youth, e.g., beats, hipsters. These rebels without a flag embody irrational chaos, rejecting all bourgeois values and seeking intense sensations, sex, drugs, crime, due to the meaninglessness of existence in the world where God is dead. Evola addresses nihilism's disguises, especially the economic social myth, Western prosperity or Marxist communism. This myth, an opiate that dulls the realization that existence is meaningless, is a form of active nihilism with widespread, spectacular dimensions. Both capitalist and communist ideologies falsely assume that existential misery is purely material/economic and will disappear with material comfort. This is refuted by the fact that extreme existential crisis, white despair, occurs amid prosperity, e.g., burned youth. The concept of global contestazione, protest, influenced by Marcuse, arises from recognizing that the capitalist and communist systems fundamentally converge into a single consumptive technological society that destroys higher values. However, this protest itself is characterized by irrationality and anarchy, lacking any higher principle, and thus falls under the sign of nothingness. Nihilism is also covered by psychoanalysis, Freudism, which reduces moral values to irrational subterranean drives, pleasure-death impulses, reflecting a deep psychological trauma and a retreat into the irrational subsoil of the soul. Evola proceeds to examine active nihilism through Nietzsche, proposing nihilism as a pathological intermediate stage to be overcome. The strong individual, having lived through nihilism, accepts freedom and lack of external meaning. They assert that life is value in itself, pessimism of strength, and must be affirmed, fidelity to the earth. This leads to the Superman, sense of the earth, justifier of existence. Evola notes Nietzsche's pseudo-solution. The Superman doctrine stops halfway, asserting a new ideal, will to power, without a superior foundation, making it merely one possible expression of life. Nietzsche's only consistent conclusion is the myth of eternal return, which acts as a test of strength and suggests an eternization of being beyond flux. The core idea for the differentiated man is be yourself, following one's own law, the Selbst self. This must be done actively, transforming negativity into positivity. The principle is be yourself, or become what you are, asserting the self's super-individual principle, absolute autonomous law without external reference, good/evil, pleasure/pain. This foundation is necessary and viable only for the differentiated man who possesses a non-fragmented inner nature. Nietzsche seeks a foundation for his new values solely within immanence, life, and nature. However, the very characteristics Nietzsche extols, like the will to overcome, mastery over the body and passions, and self-given law, require a principle superior to mere life itself. Therefore, Nietzsche's solution implicitly requires the dimension of transcendence. Evola argues that the kind of superior qualities, such as the capacity to give oneself a law, renounce passions, endure pain, or maintain impassibility, cannot originate from vita, life alone, but only from a more than life, più che vita. Evola connects vita to the general, naturalistic experience of existence. He notes that the primary force in existence is Schopenhauerian will to live as perennial, unexhausted desire, not necessarily the ascending will to power. When Nietzsche confined the assertion of value to immanence and pure naturalistic life, it led to arbitrary and inconsistent positions. The assertion of vita risks merely affirming the primitive impulses or allowing passions to assert themselves through the will. More than life, più che vita, refers to the dimension of transcendence within the individual. True strength and the positive aspects of Nietzsche's proposed way, like self-mastery and inner freedom, are explained and made possible not by vita, but only by the more than life, which acts as a principle superior to life. The path forward for the differentiated man is a conscious transformation of existential intensity. Intense life. This signifies fully engaging with existence, even in its chaotic and paroxysmal forms, which Evola often refers to as intense vitality. In Nietzsche's case, even destructive or challenging experiences sometimes led to an exasperated sensation of life or mehr Leben. However, maintaining intense life without a superior anchor risks falling into mere sensation or even becoming a passive object of the forces of dissolution, as seen in the burned youth. Transformation into more than life. The goal is a conscious change of polarity. Evola, borrowing Simmel's terminology, suggests that the extreme intensity of life can be transformed or flipped into a different quality. The principle of more than life. This represents an ontological rupture of level. This is not achieved passively, but through conscious action and internal stability that turns the toxic elements of the age into a means for liberation. This conscious shift leads to Apollonian spiritual superiority. The Dionysian tendency, which in Nietzsche was characterized by accepting life in its irrational and tragic aspects, sometimes leading to confusion, and self-destructive tendencies, must be integrated and rectified. The positive outcome of the transformation is a transition from the Dionysian plane to one of spiritual superiority, often symbolized in antiquity by the Apollonian or Olympian symbol. This state is characterized by invulnerability, calmness, and clear sovereign possession of the self, standing opposed to emotional or religious solutions and definitively excluding any naturalistic affirmation of life. Further on, Evola clarifies the spiritual dissolution in the modern world. The crisis relates specifically to the death of the god of morality, the theistic, personal god that is a projection of moral, social values, or support for human weakness. The problem is not the disappearance of a metaphysical deity, but the collapse of theistic belief, which opens the possibility of conceiving of a god beyond good and evil. Evola argues that the true foundation of strength lies in an experience of transcendence that is impersonal and superpersonal. This principle is recognized as anterior and superior to every antithesis, including good/evil and immanence/transcendence, when conceived unilaterally. This perspective grants existence a supreme justification, liberating one from the constraints of nihilistic demolition. This superior vision, rooted in traditional doctrines like Hinduism's non-dual identity, the world of becoming, and nirvana, the unconditioned, or the Gnostic-like idea that Osiris is a black god, shows that the moralistic personal god and the restricted concept of a rational and moral providential order are not essential to a true metaphysical worldview. The goal for the differentiated man is to achieve an essentiality by assuming their naked being directly in function of transcendence. This realization ensures that the spiritual core, which is invulnerable to nihilism, remains untouched. In this state, God ceases to be an object of belief or need. Thus, the terms believer and atheist or freethinker become meaningless. This is the position beyond theism and atheism. The path for the differentiated man requires 2 degrees of proving the self. 1. First degree, know thyself, unification. This means recognizing and stabilizing the central tendency of one's nature, which is difficult in the fragmented modern age. This is done by subjecting oneself to experiences, a test knowledge of self, that force one's true nature, prevalent force to reveal itself. This leads to the unity of the being and self-given law. Second degree, transcendence, invulnerability. This is the experimental proof of the superpersonal, unconditioned core, transcendence, within oneself. This requires achieving positive anomia, beyond self-given law, by consciously breaking the level of one's determinate nature and maintaining inner stability even in the void/formlessness. This results in absolute invulnerability. The general orientation for the integrated man in dealing with chaotic existence is achieved by synthesizing Dionysus and Apollo. Nietzsche's concept of Dionysus, the affirmation of life in its irrational, tragic aspects, is rooted in a modern, often misconstrued philosophy. The true Dionysian path is a mystery rite where extreme intensity of life consciously breaks its level and transforms into more than life, realizing transcendence within. Apollo, representing spiritual superiority, is the true content of the Dionysian path's positive realization. The desired state is Apollonian spiritual superiority, invulnerability, integrated with the Dionysian experience, or Apollonian Dionysianism. This is an intrepid openness/abandonment to all experiences, chaos, senses, contingency, without being lost. This superior state is characterized by lucid magnetic ebreza, intoxication, ecstasy, and internal detachment, calmness, that coexists with fully lived experience, confirming absolute invulnerability. The differentiated man's conscious actions must follow two traditional maxims. 1. Action without desire, act without regard for results. This is doing what must be done with impersonality. 2. Action without acting. The superior principle, the self, essere, remains the true subject and moving force, even if the person is actively engaged. This pure action stems from the deepest super-individual core and achieves wholeness in the fragment and straightness in the curved. It is distinct from naturalistic, pleasure-seeking vita. The goal is to transcend morality through knowledge of causes and effects, karma. The moral notion of sin is replaced by the objective fact of error or fault. Actions are assessed based on objective consequences, not moralistic sanctions. This knowledge allows the integrated man to accept objective reactions and maintain freedom. Evola introduces existentialism, both philosophical and lived, as a sign of the times. 1. Existence precedes essence. Primacy is given to the concrete, unique self in its specific situation. 2. Inauthenticity. This state, or self-forgetting, arises from being thrown into routine, superficial, daily life, characterized by equivocation and tranquilization. 3. Authenticity. This is achieved by confronting the nothingness, void, underlying existence, and the problem of one's deeper being beyond the social self. Evola notes that existentialists, being modern men, use profane, abstract categories. While seemingly aligning with his views on affirming one's nature, existentialism is flawed by overvaluation of situationality, failing to grasp the transcendent dimension needed for genuine self-mastery. Existentialism is marked by internal yielding and ultimately represents a philosophy of crisis. Sartre sees human essence in the annihilating act, where every action or goal is a negation of being and a move toward nothingness, a non-existent possibility. For Sartre, freedom, choice, annihilating, and temporalizing are the same thing. The consequence of this absolute freedom is that man is condemned to be free. The core sensation is that of being in a prison without walls, unable to find refuge in or outside himself against his absolute freedom and responsibility. This freedom is felt as a burden, leading to metaphysical angst. Evola notes that while Sartre philosophically demonstrates absolute freedom, which Nietzsche saw as an imperative for the strong man, the accompanying despair proves this freedom is suffered rather than assumed, reflecting the specific negative experience of the man in the era of nihilism. Evola proceeds to examine the existentialist theme of existence as a project thrown into the world. Philosophers like Heidegger define the self as merely an uncertain possibility of being. Because the self lacks a pre-existing metaphysical base, it only exists in the time, temporality, required for its potential to be realized. This perspective views existence as a purely horizontal, temporal process of becoming. This dependence on time and the risk of failing the project leads to existential angst. Existentialism is thus a philosophy of crisis. It introduces the idea of a mysterious pretemporal original choice that determines the life schema. Sartre argues that this choice is already made, suggesting a kind of destiny that limits subsequent freedom. This concept, a project thrown into the world, is viewed by Evola as a sign of modern crisis and the trauma of existence. Evola addresses the modern crisis of personality by distinguishing between the individual, an abstract, inform, numerical unit characterized by equality and individualism, and the person, the structured manifestation of a superordinate principle or transcendence. Evola contends that individualism led to the anonymous mass, which is an inferior impersonality. The forces of the modern world, technique, collectivism, are dissolving this individualistic personality. The differentiated man should welcome this dissolution. The person is defined by typicity, a perfect objective form that incarnates an idea or function. This leads to the superior impersonality of active anonymity. The modern alternative is either a negative, passive depersonalization, standardization leading to a void, meaningless type, or an active, positive depersonalization, burning the scoria of individuality to produce the absolute person through transcendent realization. The modern era is characterized by rapid motion and uprootedness. Uprootedness. The increasing planetary scope of movement and distance-breaking communications can serve to cultivate detachment, inner superiority, and transcendent calm while moving through the vast world, allowing one to be at home everywhere and nowhere. This represents converting the negative state imposed by civilization into a positive spiritual gain. Speed. The intense experience of speed, particularly when connected to risk, necessitates a high degree of lucidity. This challenge compels a superior inner calm and stillness. The resulting intoxication, ecstasy, can change its nature from a mere physical thrill to a quality that helps to revive and nourish the calm principle of transcendence within oneself. The concept of the animal ideal is explicitly rejected as a degenerate form of existence that corresponds to the overall nihilism of the age. This ideal champions biological well-being, comfort, physical vigor, material success, and the primitive gratification of sexual and bodily needs. Embracing this ideal signifies the atrophy of every higher form of sensitivity and interest. It is seen as a regression where the individual views himself as nothing more than a member of an animal species. For the differentiated man, finding pleasure or need in such physical abandonment or comfortable existence is merely a sign of internal weakness or lack of consistency. The differentiated man maintains a critical distance from the world, engaging in an active depersonalization. For this individual, nature is understood objectively and broadly, encompassing both the natural world and the highly rationalized functional landscapes of modernity, dams, foundries, industrial areas. The essential characteristic of these environments is their austerity, objectivity, and non-personality. The goal is to achieve an absolute detachment and clarity. This involves removing all subjective projections, sentimentality, and personal vanity. It requires restoring to the world its distance and strangeness to the human. allowing one to perceive reality in its pure, nude, rigid, and cold elementarity. This approach aligns with the principle of neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity. This lucid, non-personal perspective finds an analog in schools of traditional wisdom, such as Zen. In this state, reality is perceived in the pure quality of being things just as they are. Mundane facts, like a cloud or falling rain, acquire an absolute meaning precisely because they are perceived without human purpose or intention. This experience is described as a spiritual opening that has overcome the bond of the physical ego, where the immanent becomes transcendent and the transcendent becomes immanent. Evola asserts that modern science has no value as knowledge. Instead, it is based on a formal renunciation of knowledge in the true sense. The traditional concept of truth is foreign to modern science. Scientific inquiry is concerned only with hypotheses and formulas that can predict the course of phenomena and reduce them to a certain unity with the maximum approximation possible. The scientific system is merely a net tightening around a quid, something that remains incomprehensible in itself. The goal is not understanding, but rather subjugating this reality for practical purposes. Modern science, even in its most recent forms, like post-classical physics, has not allowed man to penetrate deeper into reality. On the contrary, it has estranged him further from it. The shift from matter to energy, or the consideration of multi-dimensional space, occurs only in abstract mathematical terms, leaving the ultimate meaning of observed phenomena, like light, the sun, or falling rain, no more transparent to the human experience. The organizing and motive force behind modern science is not the ideal of knowledge, but exclusively a practical necessity. The impulse to know has been transformed into an impulse to dominate. This orientation towards practicality and domination, or will to power, aimed at the physical world, defines the scientific procedures even in the phase of pure research. The criterion for scientific theories and ideas is based on what is most comfortable for organizing the data of sensory experience. The scientific system inherently rejects data that is qualitative, unrepeatable, or incapable of being mathematized, focusing instead on what is manageable. Modern science uses specific procedures that guarantee precision and control, but at the expense of qualitative reality. Modern physics has become completely algebraized. With concepts like the pluridimensional continuum, the purely geometric and spatial categories that previously formed a schematic, intuitive basis have been mathematized without residue. For instance, in Einsteinian physics, notions like force, energy, and movement disappear, replaced by abstract algebraic functions. This process is described as a radical exacerbation of abstract intellect. The concept of certainty in modern science is reduced to that of maximum probability, meaning all scientific certainties have an exclusively statistical character. In late subatomic physics, the law of causality itself is replaced by statistical averages. The fundamental impulse is to schematize and organize the material of phenomena in the simplest and most manageable way possible. This process, evident since the principle of simplex sigillum veri, simplicity is the seal of truth, prioritizes practical human intellectual needs over genuine truth. The ultimate outcome of this methodology is a closed system that cannot reach an external, objective reality. By limiting itself to problems that man himself poses to nature, modern science means that man encounters only himself. The process of extreme abstraction in physics, which rejects sensory experience and common sense, is seen as a counterfeiting of the traditional spiritual path of elevating the mind beyond sensory experience. While this older path led to the realm of the intelligible world and deeper knowledge, the modern path leads instead to the realm of pure mathematical thought, the spectral and Kabbalistic dominion of quantity, which is indifferent to quality and living forces. This system, while practically powerful, is spiritually impoverished, leaving man estranged from reality. The alternative is sought through phenomenology, e.g. Husserl, which aims to liberate direct experience from abstract theories and subjective interpretations using the principle of epoche, suspension of judgment. The goal is to perceive the phenomenon as it truly is, a manifestation of being. This process leads to the transcendental I, or self. When the light of this self projects onto phenomena, it creates a unfolding, revealing the immanent content of meaning, where direct intuition coincides with significance. This approach promises the transparency of the real, distinct from modern scientific abstraction. However, phenomenology often remains abstract philosophy created by modern specialists, acting as a parody of traditional wisdom. For the differentiated man, recognizing the spiritual irrelevance of modern science is a salutary end to an illusion. Achieving genuine opening requires interior awakening and not mere mental exercises. The antagonism between culture and politics is viewed as one of the most typical expressions of this cultural neutralization. Intellectuals, operating under the ideals of liberalism and literary humanism, often show an almost hysterical intolerance toward anything related to the political sphere, such as state authority, severe discipline, war, power, and dominion. The necessary, normal, and creative condition, the opposite of this split, would be one where a single idea, the elementary and central symbol of a given civilization, acts as a unifying force, operating congenially and in parallel, though often invisibly, on both the political plane and the plane of thought, culture, and the arts, thus excluding any fundamental antagonism or schism. Since such an organic civilization no longer exists, the deleterious alternative of neutral culture or culture subservient to base political forces prevails. The dissolution of modern art manifests in several key ways. 1. Intimistic tendencies. Art, particularly literature, e.g. Joyce, Proust, Gide, withdraws into private subjectivity, prioritizing the psychologically or aesthetically interesting. This is characteristic of a feminia spirituality, ignoring political/historical forces. 2. Pure art, formalism. Some art focuses on pure perfection of expression, viewing content as irrelevant. This is a further stage of dissociation. 3. Avant-garde, dissolution. Movements like Expressionism, Dadaism, and Surrealism mainly offer revolt and reflect the general dissolutive process, nihilism, of the era. Their creations are significant as signs of the times, not constructive, stable art. 4. Auto-dissolution. The exhaustion of these movements should logically lead to the auto-dissolving of modern art, creating a spiritual void. This void is not conducive to forming a new great style because the age lacks a unifying objective center or symbol. 5. Subjectivism in narrative. Most contemporary literature remains subjectivist, focusing on the fetishization of human relations, insignificant sentimental, sexual, or social problems of insignificant individuals. 6. Art as voluptuary item. Art has been reduced to a voluptuary article, luxury item, for idle parasites, reflecting its complete loss of organic necessity in society. Ultimately, the dissolution legitimizes a skepticism toward art, which, for the differentiated man, appears insignificant, abstract, and spiritually irrelevant. However, the corrosion of literature against bourgeois ideals may be seen as positive, potentially clearing space for a superior realism by attacking the non-essential conventional aspects of yesterday's world. Modern music reflects dissolution through two paths: abstract intellectualization/formalism, leading to a musical ice age or elemental physical rhythm. Jazz is the popular rhythmic extension of the latter, promoting a mechanical, disintegrating, primitivistically ecstatic, apossessed state derived from Negro exotic rhythms. This widespread acceptance and penetration of such rhythms signal a fundamental change in sensibility, moving away from the preceding musical expressions that reflected the bourgeois soul, such as melodramatic or pathetic romantic era music. The prevalence of this music indicates that the destructive processes affecting society are not superficial or marginal, but rather a rapid and organic transformation of sensibility. Jazz corresponds to an aspect of the emergence of the elemental in the modern world, signifying the dissolutive closing of the bourgeois era. The bourgeois era is defined as the collapsing system that took shape after the Third Estate Revolution and the First Industrial Revolution. For the differentiated man, this rhythmic chaos, often associated with drugs, hysteria, is a challenge to generate lucid internal intoxication by reacting from the interior being. The modern music, particularly in its latest forms, like beat music, promotes an obsessive, repetitive rhythm, like the African tam-tam, leading to paroxysmal contortions and inarticulate screams, creating a collective primitive state resembling the hysterical possession seen in savage rites. The widespread use of drugs, like those used by the Beat generation associated with sex and alcohol, is often linked to this environment, serving as a means of ecstatic evasion. The increasing use of drugs is observed especially among youth, who seek evasion because they have perceived, more or less distinctly, the void of modern existence and the rigid routines of current civilization. The Beat generation is explicitly mentioned as associating alcohol, sexual orgasm, and drugs as essential ingredients for their sense of life. They used these means, including drugs, to sustain themselves against the spiritual anguish that arose from the perceived absurdity of a square, secure, and industrialized world. Drugs represent means that have often been transposed onto the profane and physical plane. Originally, similar substances were used in ancient traditions or primitive populations, sometimes following rituals and spiritual preparation, as coadjuvants for openings to the supersensible in initiatory practices. For example, strong tobacco extracts were used among American Indians during neophyte preparation to obtain visions and signs, and substances like coca, mezcal, and peyote extracts were part of sacred rituals in Central and South America. Despite the illusion of superior freedom, exaltation, or unknown intensity of sensation they provide, drugs typically have a destructive character. The real, unperceived effect of the substance is usually a stupor and a lesion of the self, leading to a state where the individual is acted upon rather than acting intentionally. This occurs because the action of the substance is often too strong, sudden, unforeseen, and external to engage the self. For drug use to have a potentially positive outcome, it would require an exceptional degree of spiritual activity from the user, and the attitude must be the opposite of needing them to flee tension or anguish. Schematically, if the drug releases energy X exteriorly, an act of the self must insert a double energy, X plus X, into that current and maintain it. This intentional counteraction is necessary to prevent the process from being simply passive. Otherwise, the individual risks psychic disorganization. Positive use would enable the experience to be deconclusionalized, allowing for potential contacts with a higher dimension of reality, akin to the spiritual goals of ancient non-profane uses. However, this kind of realization must eventually replace the use of the drug itself as a method to achieve analogous states. No modern state or political party possesses true legitimacy. This lack of legitimacy stems from the fact that contemporary political and social structures operate within a pervasive climate of dissolution and general disorder, often being merely badly restrained. Modern political activity appeals to irrational and sub-intellectual forces, or is driven solely by material and utilitarian interests. Consequently, no existing idea, cause, or objective is deemed worthy of a differentiated man's complete engagement or true being. Given this fundamental absence of legitimate political structures, the differentiated man must adopt the principle of apolitia. Apolitia translates to inner detachment. It signifies an irrevocable inner distance from modern society and its prevalent values. This detachment is necessary for self-defense. It is a retreat to an internal line of trenches so that which cannot be controlled externally cannot internally affect the individual. This is not a withdrawal resulting from a lack of principles or true nihilism, but rather from possessing precise, solid, and uncompromising principles. Evola connects this principle historically to the Stoics, noting that their detachment from a politically dissolving world was paired with an allegiance to an ideal state and a severe individual ethic. Apolitia is primarily an internal attitude, and it does not preclude activity in the external world. The goal is to engage in impersonal action where the value lies solely in the quality of the action itself, regardless of its external outcome or object. This perspective mandates maintaining detachment even regarding the major geopolitical conflicts of the time, specifically the struggle between the democratic capitalist West and the communist East. This struggle is deemed spiritually meaningless because the West does not represent a superior idea. Both civilizations share a common ground of nihilism and dissolution, as the Western model is built upon the negation of traditional values. The societal domain is dissolving. Organic units like nation and family collapse into an amorphous mass. Modern society, dominated by material economic interests and uncontrolled population growth, operates absurdly. The differentiated man adopts internal detachment, rejecting this non-organic reality and its social myths. The crisis of patria/nation, modern, regressive, collective myths, is a potential liberation. True superior unity must be based on transnational ideas and a shared internal nature, moving commitment towards a cause, not national ties. The family and marriage are dissolved, non-organic and petit bourgeois institutions. Paternal spiritual authority and generational continuity are lost. Religious marriage is a profane facade, contaminated by conformism and sex repulsion, reducing unions to mere procreation. The differentiated man must maintain detachment as these ties are meaningless. The superior goal is vertical elevation, not horizontal physical generation. Examination of sexual relations necessitates divorcing them from dissolving bourgeois morality and taboos. The crisis of these institutions is viewed as potentially positive because it strikes at conceptions where notions like honor and virtue were aberrantly linked to sexuality and conventional marriage. However, the current wave of sexual freedom often results in the banalization and primitivization of sex, focusing on the liberation of sex rather than liberation from it. This is associated with the animal ideal. This process manifests as a pervasive, collective, and abstract eroticism fueled by media and commercialized pornography, which leads to the desaturation of sexual polarity. For the differentiated man, sexual relations are assessed not by conventional moral standards, but by their capacity to uphold self-mastery. He demands a high degree of sexual liberty, governed by the principle, you are allowed to do what you know you can also refrain from doing if you want to. Engaging in sexual freedom without this prerequisite of internal control or detachment leads to negative forms, such as the chaotic search for exasperated sensations to cover the existential void, often associated with groups seeking intense orgasm or using drugs. The objective of superior sexual relationships is transcending mere naturalistic or sentimental connections, establishing ties based on loyalty, camaraderie, independence, and courage. When adequately assumed, the sexual experience possesses metaphysical valences and utilizes elemental polarity to generate a special active and vitalizing intoxication. This state functions as an aliment that can induce an existential rupture of level and provide openings beyond ordinary consciousness. The realization of this superior path is contingent upon the nature of the partner, specifically the presence of the absolute woman. Unfortunately, modern female existence often hinders this, as women pursuing parity with men often only mimic the male's involution, leading to a diminished inner state. The woman's move toward professional life and equality is frequently interpreted as a renunciation of her right to be a woman, compromising the elemental and potentially dangerous spiritual force necessary for superior polar relationships. The concept of the seconda religiosità is drawn from Spengler's analysis of history, which suggests that this phenomenon is an illusion constantly accompanying the terminal phases of a civilization. The current Western civilization is in a disanimated, collectivistic, and materialistic phase, corresponding to the closing of a cycle. This second religiosity is described as a compensatory and passive phenomenon. It appears as sporadic forms of spirituality and mysticism, sometimes involving eruptions of the supersensible, but these are symptoms of decay, not a true spiritual resurgence. It often manifests as occultism or pseudo-spiritualism, including various movements, sects, and lodges that aim to provide the modern Western man with something beyond exhausted dogmatic religion and materialism. However, this is critically identified as an descending self-transcendence, in opposition to true, ascending self-transcendence. This phenomenon is considered dangerous. For instance, where morbid interest in the occult and sensational is accompanied by evocative practices or the opening of subterranean layers of the psyche, like in spiritualism or psychoanalysis, these activities are likened to fissures in the Great Wall, which are perilous breaches in the protective barrier that shields the normal individual from obscure real forces. The seconda religiosità deforms true tradition. Although these movements often borrow themes, doctrines, or symbols from the legitimate perennial tradition, especially Oriental varieties, they typically reduce these elements to counterfeits, residues, or fragments mixed with Western prejudices and personal ramblings. This distorted understanding often serves as a mere surrogate or an emotional replacement for the lost Western religion, failing to grasp the severe and metaphysical nature of true initiatory teachings. The differentiated man views death as a touchstone for verifying inner calm and certainty in transcendence. Life is a transient section in a continuum. Suicide is admitted only as an act of sovereignty/internal freedom, Stoic/Buddhist precedents, reflecting fidelity to a prenatal choice. The highest goal is intense living until death and ultimate meaning coincide. Unlike the man of today, who is often traumatized or experiences angst regarding death, or the existentialist who conceives of existence as being toward death, Heidegger, the differentiated man's internal certainty in the dimension of the being or self, the transcendent principle within, should ensure that the contemplation of death neither paralyzes nor changes his conduct. This attitude is characterized by an internal stability that prevents him from losing control of himself, even in the face of risks and difficulties. The core transcendent view holds that life is a transient section in a continuum. The existence in the human condition on Earth is metaphysically only a restricted section in a stream that passes through multiple states. Birth is conceived as a change of state, and death as another change of state. This perspective promotes security, firmness, and an intense, liberated form of living, because the individual does not believe that his true being begins with physical birth or ends with physical death. The differentiated man's view on self-inflicted death, the right over one's life, aligns with certain traditional philosophies that permit it only as a demonstration of internal freedom and sovereignty. Suicidal acts motivated by affective or passionate reasons, i.e., due to difficulties, unbearable circumstances, or feeling weak in the face of irrational forces in the soul, are rejected as they indicate passivity and impotence. Suicide driven by desperation, weariness, or the frustration of life's desires is deemed an extreme form of attachment to life itself, not liberation from it. The admission of suicide is aligned with the philosophies of Stoicism, particularly Seneca, and Buddhism. The Stoic justification of suicide is viewed as an act of sovereignty over the self, allowing the superior individual the absolute right to end the game if he chooses, provided the decision is made from a place of impassibility and supreme freedom, not weakness. This right is reserved only for the self, signifying that the current existence has the individual's assent and that he is truly active in his path, not merely making a necessity into a virtue. A higher context for this act is found in the traditional doctrine that suggests the individual person and their life's path proceed from a prenatal and pretemporal original choice or original project, according to existentialist reflection. This project determines the essential content of one's existence, including its potentially problematic or dramatic aspects. In this context, the highest responsibility is fidelity to this transcendental choice. If the differentiated man were to choose to end his life, it would signify a break made from a position of sovereignty over the person, asserting that the underlying transcendent principle is acting. The ultimate aim is not merely resignation or enduring life, but achieving a state where intense living until death and ultimate meaning coincide. This approach means using life circumstances, even chaotic or risky ones, to pose a peremptory and insistent question to destiny, actively seeking the profound, impersonal reason for existence. The ideal scenario is reached when the experience of living intensely and dangerously leads to situations where the frontier between life and death also represents the extreme limit of the sense and fullness of a life. This condition represents a positive transformation where the intensity of life becomes a means ordered toward a more than living. The goal is to establish an inner magnetic force that will snap at the right moment, death, ensuring the being is carried beyond this existence.